Welcome to a special edition of Your Health. My guest today is Ronnie Andrews, and for the last 15 years, he has spent his time with oncology. However, prior to that, he spent his time with infectious diseases, starting with HIV, then SARS-1, and then H1N1, and now, of course, COVID2 and COVID-19. Well, Ronnie, thank you so much for being with us. I really do appreciate you taking the time. You've had quite a history in the diagnostics arena. Just give me a little background.
Thanks, Lisa, and thanks for having me today. By the way, this was a great opportunity for me to go brush up on the first 18 years of my career in diagnostics in the world of infectious disease and virology. So it was a great opportunity to learn a lot about what's going on today and how it compares to before. My life has been spent, I'm a scientist by training, but I spent most of my life in the business of molecular diagnostics and in the early days, just what we call clinical diagnostics. In the early days, worked in the world of looking at antibodies and how they respond to viruses. So I worked for a company called Abbott Diagnostics in the early days, and they were sort of the early pioneer in hepatitis A, B, and C testing. And then from there, we had this crazy outbreak of this unknown disease, and it was first HTLV1, then HTLV2, then ultimately HTLV3. All on the antibody side, doing antibody testing to look for patients that had the disease, and then obviously doing the appropriate measures to either treat or to quarantine those patients. And so ultimately, I ended up in the molecular world once we started having access to the genome of these viruses, and spent the next 10 years working in various capacities of launching and developing tests in virology. With the biggest opportunity for me was HIV and being the chief commercial officer of Roche Molecular, which owned the patents to what is PCR, which everybody's hearing in the news today, we'll talk about that today. And I was very fortunate to be able to lead the deployment of that genotyping test into 47 countries at a time when, as you know, it was expanding rapidly around the world, and we desperately needed it. That time was very emotional and very impactful in my life, and really moved me on towards where we are today in the world of molecular oncology. So. Right.
And, it feels like history is kind of repeating itself, but with an entirely new situation. Not uncommon to you, of course, because you've been involved for so long, but certainly uncommon to many of us and many of our community members. Maybe you can tell me, what is the difference between the definition between COV2 and COVID-19? We've heard various things, and people are referring to COVID-19 probably more than you'd like to hear.
Yeah, let me say this. I think as a purist from the world of virology in the early days, it's real important to distinguish the COVID-2 infection or a viral infection from the disease it causes. And I relate it to, not everybody that was HIV positive got AIDS and died from AIDS. And so you have to be very careful in the loose use of these words and the nomenclature. Listen, everybody's using COVID-19 for everything now, but I think as your viewers start to look at data, it's important for them to discriminate the difference between the number of positive cases of infection of COVID-2 versus the actual percentage of people that get COVID, which turns into what we call acute respiratory distress syndrome, or ARDS, which is the major cause of the deaths we're seeing from this virus. And I don't want to diminish the severity of the situation, but to get all that confused can create a lot of fear and anxiety. We are seeing a lot of cases, and we have some data I think you'll show based on the fact we got a lot more testing coming into the pipeline today. So the number of positive COVID-2 infections will increase significantly. That doesn't mean the number of acute cases and deaths will increase proportionally to that climb.
Right. Now, please tell me, COVID, what does it stand for?
Well, it stands for coronavirus ID, or in the infectious disease world, it's been deemed the Chinese originated virus for infectious disease. And so it depends on who you are and where you are in the system. But I've heard it referred to as both. We, in my world, it's SARS, severe acute respiratory syndrome, coronavirus 1, and now SARS coronavirus 2, and that's the actual name of the virus itself. So.
Okay. Well, thank you for defining that, because, as I mentioned, we're hearing it all over the place, and very rarely do you hear COVID-2.
Right, exactly. I'm hoping your viewers will understand, because it is important to note that there will be 88% of the population that will be that gets COVID-2 infection that will not get COVID. And that's a real important distinction for us as we think about our own personal health and how we might react to certain infections.
Right. And even though people are getting COVID-19, there are still people who are recovering just fine from it.
Significant number of cases. In fact, there's data, if you look, there's data from some research that was done on 44,000 patients in China. I know that there's a debate on how accurate are those data, but these data have been published in peer-reviewed papers to date. And in that data, you'll see that the vast majority of the patients that go on to COVID are older patients, above 70 years old.
Mm-hmm.
And of those patients that have died, there's at least, I think 48% of those patients have at least 3 comorbidities, which means they're older, they have other diseases, and the infection of COVID-2 rapidly takes over their immune system and becomes COVID. And unfortunately, they get ARDS, and very few of them respond and recover from ARDS. But we are seeing the vast majority of cases, of severe cases, which is about 12 to 13% in that study, they did recover. And so, you have to be careful. I know yesterday I saw a slide that really made me a little nervous. It showed the number of total cases in the world, and then it showed the number of deaths, and then it showed the number of recovered. Well, you have to assume that the number of cases in the world that aren't deaths will equal recovery. That's not how it's being presented. So I think it's important to keep all this in perspective. We don't know how this is all going to play out. It is a different virus than SARS-CoV-1 in some respects, but it's also very similar at the genetic level. So.
Okay. All right. Well, perfect. And we do show the slide there that talk a little bit about that. So now let's go into testing for both. Now, are there different ways for testing each? I know that they've been talking a lot about rapid testing.
Right.
But you also mentioned RNA testing. So maybe you could kind of outline the differences for us.
Yeah, I will. And there's a very important slide that your viewers will get to see that talks about the overview. There's the identification of the virus in an active infection, and that is done using a test called real-time PCR, looking for viral replication in the body. And that is the best and most sensitive way we have of identifying a positive case. And as you know, this is even more important in SARS-CoV-2 because not every positive case actually gets sick. So you have 85, 87% of the population that doesn't feel symptoms or light symptoms, and they don't know what it is. And they're out potentially sharing that disease with other people. And so I think from that perspective, it's important that we think through and understand the difference between how all that works, right? And so there's the viral test itself, RNA, that we look for. And then there's the new rapid test. And the rapid test looks for fragments of the fragments of the RNA of the virus, but does not actually look at the whole RNA string. So because of that, it really moves upstream a little bit. And so it's not really relevant to look for all active cases using a rapid test, but that rapid test is better used when the patient's symptomatic or the healthcare worker is symptomatic, and you can rapidly triage, are the symptoms COVID related or are the symptoms flu related? Mm-hmm. And that will allow us to quarantine and treat the COVID infections separately from the rest of the infections that show up in an emergency room. And so I think the rapid test is exciting. I'm glad we have it. It's important. But in order to understand positive cases that are asymptomatic, you really have to get the full RNA test. And that's the test that people get their nasal swab. It gets sent out, and it takes about a day. It's a really 2-hour test, but because of transportation back and forth, it takes about a day to get the results back. I know there's a backlog in the United States today. I follow that very closely. We've gone from 14 days to 10 days. I think I saw yesterday the average is about 4 to 5 days now. Here in Orange County, I'm blessed to say that we found a way to get the test at the local hospitals done about that fast. So we're starting to see breakthrough there just because the backlog of the large reference labs that are used by the local hospitals is starting to diminish because of the number of tests that are now in the supply chain. So that's good news. And the last test, Lisa, is really the one that really allows us to get back to work, and that's the antibody test. So we have RNA for active disease, potentially asymptomatic. We have the fragment test, or what they call isothermal PCR test, which is your 5-minute test to say, is this symptomatic patient, is it COVID or not? And then you have the antibody test. Has someone been exposed or actually had the disease and now built up antibodies against it? And the knowledge of that is important for 2 reasons. One, those patients can donate plasma, and the antibodies that are rich in that plasma can help severe ARDS patients recover. So that's one way you can help in the community if you have a positive antibody test. The other is, once you're positive for the antibody, if coronavirus 2 or COVID2 plays out like COVID-1, like H1N1, these all created, your body created an immunity, and your immune system has a memory to that immunity. And so if they get exposed again, their antibodies are prepared and they wipe out the disease or the virus before it replicates and gets started. So those are the 2 real important reasons to know if we're antibody positive. And the good news is, I saw yesterday 2 were approved. I think there'll be more being approved. This is not a difficult test to build. It's something we've been doing since the mid-'70s. We've been doing these types of immune sandwiches with an antigen and antibody, and then you tag it with a color and you can see if it's there. So these are tests that should be able to rapidly be built and get to market. And these will be nice little finger stick tests that go in a little cartridge, much like a home pregnancy test.
So how would you participate in that? I mean, you obviously would have to be diagnosed with it first. I guess at what point would they start to use this to find out who has the antibodies?
Well, the best use today is your healthcare workers, as they get exposed, to see if they're building antibodies against it. I also, if you've been sick and you don't know if you had it because you didn't go get a test when you were feeling bad. For me, I had a really horrible, flu-like symptoms, but very similar now to what we know this to be back in mid-December, right before Christmas. And so I'm interested. I want to go see, because I know there was a version potentially in the United States in late November. And so was it a less virulent round, and I got it and have antibodies. So I'm curious to find out if I indeed have antibodies to it, because that would allow me now to go and be helpful to the community by getting out and not worrying about being reinfected.
Well, I don't think you're alone. Many of us got sick during that time frame, and we're all probably thinking the same thing. Maybe we had something like that, but we don't know.
Yeah, I think we'll know when we get these antibody tests. It'll be interesting to see the epidemiology of this, and that will help us as we look back on this historically and say, what did we learn from that as we prepare for? Well, we'll always have coronaviruses. This is the common cold virus. This one happens to be on steroids, unfortunately, and causing a lot of harm to a lot of people. But we will not see the end of coronaviruses when COVID-2 ends. I do hope we see a herd immunity take place over time. I suspect that we've interrupted that herd immunity cycle now because of the stay-at-home directives, which is awesome for what we've been able to do to bend the curves. But I do think there will be a rebound, but by this fall we should have vaccines, and maybe not vaccines by the fall, but certainly therapeutics. There's a drug called remdesivir, which is a drug that was being built by Gilead for Ebola, and thank God we didn't have an Ebola pandemic, but because it's a much more severe disease. But that drug activity, the mechanism of action, blocks the ACE pathway, which is how the virus attaches to your cell and breaks through and puts its RNA in your cell. So if we can see some of those drugs that bind the cells or the virus's ability to enter the cell, which is how we solved HIV, which is how we solved Ebola and some of these other really severe viruses. So I think that there's hope on the way, and the vaccines hopefully by summer. I think there's 12 in cycle now, 3 already in phase 1 trials. We expect all 12 of those to be in phase 1 trials by the end of June. So there's hope, obviously, that we'll have a vaccine by next winter. But I do think you'll see a rebound. It won't be near as bad as this go around, but we need to be prepared for it. So back to your point, having the antibody test and knowing who's been exposed, who has the antibodies, will be essential as we go back to work in the summer and the fall.
So let's talk a little bit about some of the medications that you mentioned. So obviously the one you mentioned, but then there's a couple of others that have been talked about in the news media fairly regularly in a combination with the Z-Pak. What do you know about that?
Right. So chloroquine is an old therapeutic that was developed in the malaria era and it had a mechanism of action against the malaria RNA that's similar to what we see in COVID-1 and 2. There's different data. I'm seeing data where it doesn't work at all, and then I'm seeing data where for really sick people, it's helping slow the progression of the disease down. And obviously, in combination with what we affectionately call the Z-Pak, and the Z-Pak, the mechanism of action of the Z-Pak actually has an anti-inflammatory capacity. So in the lung tissue where these air sacs are being inflamed, and if you think about what the chloroquine does is it actually helps the immune system strengthen against the right endpoints, and then you have the anti-inflammatory and antibacterial component of Z-Pak, and so the secondary infections aren't happening. So these patients with already severe lung challenges aren't getting a bacterial infection to complement the viral infection, and so the viral pneumonia becomes a single morbidity that physicians work towards to cure and get the patients out of the hospital. So there's a lot of hope in that. As you know, my wife is a lupus patient, and we've got a lot of affiliation with chloroquine, or what we call Plaquenil in my world. And it has been a lifesaver for her through the years. And so I hope it is a product that does work in patients, because it's easy to get a hold of. It's off patent for the most part. It's not an expensive drug, and we could treat a lot of people globally with that drug. It's by mouth. You take it by mouth. It's not a parenteral. So a lot of good things could come if that turns out to be, but the jury's still out on it. But again, we have seen positive cases where it did help.
Well, and thank goodness that they're trying different things, because obviously if you don't try, you're not going to know how it works.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, we have it's sort of a living laboratory right now, as fast as this virus has taken over our mind share and our health. And so I think treating the biology of this disease is important. And those way smarter than me in the world of research and on the front lines of medicine are looking at the biology of COVID-2 infection, just like SARS-CoV-1, just like H1N1, which this year, by the way, is influenza A, and it is a deadly virus. It's going to kill 40,000 people in the United States this year. So we can't ignore the fact that you're seeing H1N1 in conjunction in some patients with COVID. So we are still seeing the flu in combination with COVID, which is another complicating event. But for the most part, Lisa, I think that we see COVID-2 and we see the drugs that could work in context with what's worked before, and that's a good thing.
At least we're addressing both issues, and hopefully, because of what we've been doing with the stay-at-home and everything else, we're affecting the impact on the healthcare system. And let's just go to that, because there's a lot of things that we've been asked to do by our government and by our companies and things like that. And from what we can see, things just might be working. So what is your perspective on that?
Yeah, look, I've been very bullish because I've been through this so many times before. When I look at epidemiology projections, you have to take them seriously and you have to prepare. I mean, the Ebola projections were in 2013-14, as that was my last adventure with Dr. Fauci's team, and as we were looking at doing the sequencing from the company I was running at the time of the Ebola strand that was coming out of Africa to make sure it wasn't genetically engineered. And all that work, the epidemiology projections were like total global devastation. And so obviously it motivated us, as if we weren't already, to make sure that didn't happen, prepare the U.S. for that. And of course it never happened, thank goodness, because of great preparation. So I think that the epidemiology projections are real. I think they are certainly sobering for all of us. But I think you have a curve of data that I just pulled last night. If you look at that and you look at the 7-day rolling average, you're starting to see, even with the significant increase in testing in the United States, now that the supply chains are filling up, we're starting to see our curve of COVID positive cases, or COVID-2 positive cases, we're starting to see that curve starting to bend, and that's a great thing. If you look ahead of us at people that have been out ahead of us for 2 to 3 weeks, you're starting to see places like Spain and Italy, and they're starting to really see downward trends in deaths per day and number of new cases per day. And that's what we hope to see in the U.S. soon. And, I can only encourage everyone to stay, these mandates to stay in and shelter at home, they're there for a reason. And it is very important. I mean, I'm in oncology, so for me, I still have to be at work, but for people that don't have to be, you really shouldn't be, because it's important that we give this thing another week or two, especially here in Southern California. Those numbers are really starting to get better. I'm not claiming victory yet, as you know, but I think we're starting to see a breakthrough there. And I think if we can just hang on, and I know everybody's tired of being inside, especially if you're cooped up with folks you love, but you aren't always around very much. So I got all my adult children at home. It's been a great reunion time for us. But as you might imagine, it's okay that I get out and come to the lab every day. So we keep doing what we're doing, and it's going to work. I promise it's going to work. So.
Now, originally, this is how I think we started all of this, is there was something that you had shared on Facebook, and it was an amazing illustration of how all of this has come to be. And it was put out by Yale, and it was a first-year student. And I'm going to share that link with everybody. But tell me why that's a really great resource for our community.
Yeah, you know what? I'm a big believer in educating yourself with data that's factual and not letting other folks feed you data that they want you to hear. Let me just say that. I think it's important. I'm not pointing fingers. Obviously, your station and what you do is to try to inform with facts and data, and I think that's awesome. I just encourage people to try to figure out what it is and what it means to them. And I think the Yale student that did that did it at an incredible level for everyone to understand. And those of us who are in the science world, we get geeky. I've already on this interview, I've been geeky with you, and I didn't mean to, but that is just a very, I think, beautiful explanation of virology, why COVID-2 is actually happening and what it's doing and how it replicates, how we test for it, and then why it's important to stay at home. And this is a very contagious disease compared to other diseases that we see. And if people stay at home, they reduce the impact of spreading to 2, that then spreads to 4, that then spreads to 16. And then you can kind of see how it multiplies at that point. So it's really great. And I encourage everyone to watch it. It's a short vignette, but it's really informative.
Well, I like the fact that she uses stick people. So
I failed kindergarten, so the stick people, I love the stick people. Those are terrific. So.
Yeah, she did a great job. Well, I really appreciate you taking the time with us. Always a pleasure. You are a wealth of information, and I really do appreciate you coming on.
Well, Lisa, thank you. It's always a pleasure, and I appreciate you and your desire to get to the bottom of these things. And I appreciate our community. I mean, our community has pulled together significantly during this time. It warms my heart to see how people have come together, and who knows, maybe out of this, will be a much re-enter the work world. So thank you for your time.
All right. Well, thank you. And that is our special edition of Your Health. Please join us next time as we discover more about your health. Welcome back. Now, as you know, we have been asked to stay at home. So I wanted to show you this graph that was provided to us by Kaiser Permanente, Orange County, and it kind of explains why we need to do social distancing. So if you look at the top, I know it's a little hard to read, but if you look at the top, it says that you have a single individual who can be exposed in 5 days to about 2.5 people. That means that many people in 30 days, which is approximately 406 people, could be infected. But if you look at the next slide, it says if you reduce your interactions by 50%, meaning one person would then come in contact with 1.25 people. The infection could potentially only reach 15 people in 30 days. Then if you look at the final slide at the bottom, it says if you reduce your interactions by 75%, so a single person then would interact with someone, 0.6.25 people, would potentially only infect 2.5 people within 30 days. So that is why it is super important for all of us to do our social distancing when we're outside, you know, keeping your distance as far apart as possible with a minimum of 6 feet. And then also, when you do go to the store or you do have to go get gas or whatever it is you have to do, make sure you still keep those distances, but then also make sure that you're using some form of protection for your hands, because obviously you're not going to wash your hands right away if you're in your car or if you're at the store. But anyway, I wanted to share that with you because I thought it was a really good explanation of why we are in social, in isolation here. So if you wanted additional information on that, you can always go to kp.org/Orange County. And then at the top of their website, they do have COVID-19 information. You can just click on that and they will provide you with all the information that you need to know.